Coming up on today's edition of Locked On Cougars, we are talking USF football. BYU and USF going to square off in the season opener. Going to welcome in Will Turner, of course, covering the Bulls for 24/7 Sports. Going to talk a lot of USF, and we'll also talk a little bit about the rivalry dynamic that USF has with UCF and some Big 12 ties with all of that. We'll get to all of that and more on today's edition of Locked On Cougars.
You are Locked On Cougars, your daily podcast on the BYU Cougars, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's up, everybody? I'm Jake Hatch, your host here on Locked On Cougars, your resident BYU insider, talking all things BYU every single day here on this podcast. I work for the Zone Sports Network in Salt Lake City, Utah, as the executive producer of DJ and PK in the morning. But none of that matters because today we're talking USF football, and that's where Will Turner comes in. Will covers USF for 24/7 Sports. There's a lot of other stuff on the side. But Will, thank you so much for sitting down with us today.
Yeah, of course. Appreciate you having me. I got nothing but love for the folks out in Provo, especially after last year's trip out there.
So, did you make the trip last year? Let's start there. Did you come out this past season when USF played in Provo?
Yeah, I did. I flew the day of the game because I think it was like an 8:30 or a 9:30 Mountain Time kick, and flew out to Provo, made an extended weekend out of it, and stayed, I think, in West Jordan, and ended up the weekend driving through Wasatch National Forest, and just genuinely just kind of fell in love with the area.
Well, that's awesome. Well, so obviously BYU's making a return trip to Tampa September 3rd for the season opener here. I wanted to talk to you about the kind of the nuts and bolts of USF, but I want to start with some more broad stuff. And I want to talk about something that kind of hit the Twitterverse here locally in Utah today. We're recording this on Thursday, but Utah State and BYU's series, their rivalry series, is going on hiatus. BYU and Utah State have formally agreed that in 2023, they had games scheduled between 2023 and 2026 that are essentially they've been canceled. BYU just going to the Big 12. They needed to get rid of some games, and that one was one of the sacrificial lambs, as it were, for that. We all know that UCF is, of course, the main rival for USF. That war on I-4 might be the best rivalry moniker out there, in my opinion. I truly believe it's incredible. Do you know what the dynamic is going to be between UCF and USF as UCF makes the jump to the Big 12? Are they going to continue to play? What's the status of that rivalry?
Yeah, so as of right now, there really hasn't been any formal, on the record type of agreements per se. They haven't really kind of come to a decision, but we do know as of right now that USF and UCF are scheduled to play in 2022. And I think a lot of it too kind of depends on when the exit year is for UCF.
Sure.
There's a lot of talk about them, potentially exiting early and going to the Big 12. Potential of them, staying in the American for another year. It just kind of depends on the buyout that they have to have with the AAC. And there's been a lot of debate about what that number is and where UCF is going to come up with the money, where Houston's going to come up with the money, and Cincinnati for that matter as well from the American. So, there's some questions about that. But right now on the, as it stands, USF doesn't have any non-conference space on its schedule through the 2027 season. They did a phenomenal job of trying to, really strengthen their strength of schedule. They put BYU on there 2 more times down the line. They've put Notre Dame down there 2 times down the line. Alabama's on there 3 times. I think there's another Florida trip in the mix, a couple of Miami trips as well. So they've really done a great job of beefing up the non-conference schedule. And because of that, they've been able to fill their non-conference schedule through the 27-28 season. So from strictly that perspective, the rivalry looks as though it will go on hiatus because there's just not space on USF's schedule to add that game. Now, there's a couple FCS dates in that time frame. Some games against Florida A&M, Bethune-Cookman. They scheduled a few of those. So against some in-state FCS foes. So you could always probably drop one of those games to add a UCF matchup here within the next couple of years. But until that's, the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed. So right now, it looks like that rivalry could go on hiatus as well.
Now, BYU and Utah State, they will have played 90 times in 100 years. So the first game between these two was in 1922, and this year, 2022, will be the 90th time they have squared off. And of course, as you would expect, Utah State fans are less than enthused that BYU essentially dumped them as they jump into the Big 12 here. Give me a sense of where USF fans sit with regards to that UCF rivalry. Do they want to see it, or do they say, hey, good riddance to you, see ya?
I think it's a lot of the good riddance.
Okay.
We'll see again, and if we end up in the Big 12, the rivalry is it's bitter. It's one of the most underrated rivalries in college football, I think, in college athletics. USF jumped out to a 6-2 series lead against the Knights on the football field, and then UCF, obviously, with their recent success of their 2017 run, and then, going back to a New Year's Six Bowl in 2018, UCF has really evened the tide. And it doesn't help that USF kind of shot itself in the foot with, the backlash and how the Charlie Strong era ended.
Yeah.
And just kind of how that's fed into the Jeff Scott era a little bit. USF hasn't done itself any favors, but I think the most important moniker here for USF right now is the fact that there's, in addition to the football trophy, there's an overall War on I-4 all sports trophy. And USF has yet to win that, right? Yeah. So I think this is the 6th year of its existence. It's either year 5 or year 6 of its existence. And USF has not won that trophy once. So I think USF fans, especially this year, USF has performed so poorly, especially in the major sports against UCF, in terms of, they lost the football game. They lost, a men's basketball game. They lost both women's basketball games, and women's basketball traditionally has been the best sport on campus. Softball took a season series. I think they swept USF when they came to play in Tampa. Baseball got swept by UCF in the first series, and then took 2 out of 3 in the second series. So I think USF fans are just kind of tired of getting beat up on UCF, and this is going to be UCF propaganda, I can already tell. But I think a lot of USF fans just kind of got tired of being beat up on by their rival, and they're kind of like, all right, we're fine with not seeing you for another 5-6 years, because we're just kind of tired of all the bragging and showboating on social media. And trust me, there's plenty of it.
Hey, they're BYU fans for the decade that Utah owned that rivalry. I think they can commiserate with USF fans in that circumstance. But I wanted to talk to you before we get to this. I want to get specific on USF and what BYU fans can expect in this game in a moment. But I want to get one more big picture thing from you. With regards to the Big 12, I am a proponent of bringing in USF to match with UCF in a future expansion window for the Big 12. And I also think that Boise State out here in the West would be a nice travel partner, or just another anchor out here in the western part of the country for BYU on the other side of the conference. Do you think that USF is going to make I don't know if requisite moves is the right way to term it, but will they be endeavoring in a future to find themselves in the Big 12? What do you think the future is for the Bulls?
Yeah, so I think the biggest thing for USF right now is, in college football, the biggest question regarding teams that are on the rise is, what have they done to invest in their program?
Sure.
And prior to, recent trends, USF, could say they've invested in the program, but it hasn't really been there, or the necessary steps haven't really been done. And a lot of that stemmed in the football sense, like I said previously, towards the end of the Charlie Strong era. There's been talks of an indoor practice facility being built for the last, I think the plan was introduced in 2017 or 2018, and it's and the shovels just went in the ground this last season in 2020, in the 2021 season. They had a groundbreaking ceremony in September, and that facility is finally supposed to be open for fall camp in 2022. which is a huge step, right? For any BYU fans that made the trip to Tampa in, mid-October, I remember that day being a little bit on the cooler side for Florida. But
Sure.
any BYU fan or anybody that that knows, especially Central Florida, where USF is, because it's more West Central than anything else. It rains a lot here. It rains a lot summertime. We get, either we get our storms in the morning and they go from west to east across the state, or they build in the east in the morning and they come east to west across the state. It's a daily pattern. I've lived here all 22 years of my life. It has not changed. And when you get into those summer months, when you start fall camp in August and in September, USF has had to consistently dodge raindrops, for lack of a better term. They've had to, try and avoid just having their practices postponed. I mean, they've had a handful of it, and that's why the Rays play in a dome, over in St. Pete, because it rains more times than not. So you're going to have a lot of baseball postponed. Same thing with USF practices. So, the IPF is a huge first step. The on-campus stadium that's proposed right now is another important step. And, the thing with USF that I've heard a lot of, and that's been said a lot publicly, is there's an alignment between, the board of directors, the vice president of athletics, Michael Kelly, the head football coach, Jeff Scott, the president, who was just recently elected in RIA law. There's alignment between all those parties, which is huge, because that's something that USF had never seemingly had in its 25 year football playing history. So it's good to see that, and I think obviously facilities are going to play a huge role in getting pushed towards a Power 5 conference. Now, in terms of the Big 12, I don't know if I've ever really been a fan of the Big 12 for USF, just simply because of the travel implications that it would have. I mean, outside of UCF, if they'd still, if they'd be in that conference, you're going to have to play a lot of games in the Central Time Zone. You're going to have to play a lot of games or going out to the mountains and playing BYU. Last year, USF didn't get home from the BYU trip until 4:35 a.m. Eastern Time. I mean, and you're asking, obviously that's a Saturday night, and that eats into your game week preparation too. But you're also asking the Olympic sports. You're also asking men's basketball, women's basketball to potentially make a trip out to the Marriott Center, or go to Boise State, or go anywhere along the Midwest and play a game at maybe 8-9 o'clock Eastern Time on a school night, and have to come back and play that game. Or you're asking a Kansas State, a Baylor, Texas Tech to come to Tampa to do the same thing. So I haven't really been a fan of the Big 12, simply just because of the travel aspect. I don't think it makes sense. It'll be interesting to see what UCF does and how the Big 12 schedules for UCF in that regard. In terms of conference expansion, I think the ACC could be a really good fit for USF. The question is will Florida State and Miami allow it? A lot of talk has been, if USF tries to get into the conference, will those two schools try and block? USF Vice President of Athletics Michael Kelly was a former top exec in the ACC and has some really good ties to folks in the ACC. That's how he was able to land Jeff Scott from Clemson. So I think the ACC could be a really good fit. But I think they're still at least maybe 3 or 4 years away. And at the end of the day, with football being your biggest moneymaker and your biggest revenue sport, you have to win on the football field. And USF isn't getting that part done right now.
All right. More with Will here momentarily. Will, have you ever had a Built Bar before by chance?
I have heard of the legendary Built Bars through our friend Ben Criddle.
Okay.
But I have not had one just yet.
Okay. Let me see if I can arrange to get you some delivered. Actually, they just launched, so they're a great sponsor of ours here on Locked On Cougars. So I'm gonna talk about them. I'm gonna see if I can get some sent to you, because this is a brand new flavor they just dropped. It's called the Birthday Cake Puff. And what it is, anybody who's listening to this podcast or watching it, it is a first of its kind marshmallow that's been infused with protein. It's absolutely just incredible. Covered in 100% chocolate. They're absolutely delicious. And if you've not tried them, like Will, who I'm gonna try and hook up, I'm gonna try and get some sent out to him. You can get You can get the built.com right now and place your order there. Promo code LOCKED15 will get you 15% off. That's LOCKED15 for 15% off your order. The macros on this are absolutely incredible. Just 150 calories, 16 grams of protein packed into this bar with only 9 grams of sugar. You just can't beat it. It's as good as a candy bar. I'm serious about this, everybody. Give them a shot. That is built.com to place your order now. That birthday cake puff is a one of a kind. It's here for a short time only. It's got sprinkles on it. I was looking at this thing. I'm like, there's no way this thing can be healthy, but the macros are absolutely nuts. Give it a shot. That's promo code LOCKED15 at built.com. All right,
yeah,
more.
You're gonna have to put me on that, man. That sounds good, man. I've been needing to get back in the gym, and maybe I need a good protein bar. I need them to start shipping to Florida on a regular basis.
Hey, we can help make that happen. They're actually based here in Utah, so we can work on that. Will Turner, you see right below there, W Turner 24/7 on Twitter. If you want to follow him, you can follow this show, Locked On Cougars, on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter. Just search out Locked On Cougars. Always love interacting with you guys, and thank you for making us your first listen of the day. All right, Will, let's get into some of the nitty gritty with regards to USF, because BYU fans, I think, are very interested in how USF is going to look in the season opener here in 2022 after watching them in 2021. And I think it starts at the quarterback position. We all just heard that Gerry Bohanon, a guy that BYU fans are familiar with because he led just Baylor to an absolute romp over BYU in their game last year, he is transferring to USF. Timmy McClain, I thought, had his moments last year at quarterback for USF. So lay it out for us. What is the quarterback situation for the Bulls?
Man, I've been on this beat for 5 years, and if any USF fans are listening to this, I mean, they're just gonna tell me I sound like a broken record. I've been on this beat for 5 years, and there's been a quarterback competition, whether it's at the start of the season, whether it's in season, whether it's whenever. There's been a quarterback competition all 5 years of the beat that I've been on this beat. So when I heard that Gerry Bohanon was when I heard that Gerry Bohanon was going to be transferring in, I was like, well, here we go again. But there was already going to be a bit of a quarterback competition heading out of the spring, and that happens anytime you get a new offensive coordinator. USF just hired former West Virginia inside receivers and tight ends coach Travis Trickett. He made the jump. He's back to being an offensive coordinator. He was an offensive coordinator at Georgia State as well as Florida Atlantic. And he replaces Charlie Weiss Jr., who took the job at Ole Miss with Lane Kiffin. I was trying to find the right words there, but took the job at Ole Miss with Lane Kiffin, and so Trickett comes in, having his offensive coordinator experience. I think he spent 4 or 5 years with Neil Brown at West Virginia. Now, obviously, you've got a quarterback competition to begin with between Timmy McClain and Travis Marsh. Marsh has kind of been a spot starter here and there. Started the 2020 conference opener against Cincinnati, and then started the 2021 game at East Carolina when McClain was dealing with, I think it was a hamstring injury or something of the sort. It was a rainy night. Marsh threw, I think, 2-3 interceptions, and a couple of them were coachable. A couple of them could have been wet ball type of situations. He's got a really good deep ball, Marsh does, and I think coming out of spring, he looked definitely the more impressive quarterback in the spring game than McClain did. McClain is BYU fans saw it. He can escape, situations that a lot of quarterbacks can't. I mean, he's got really, really good escapability. He's got really good, vision down the field to be able to, make guys miss, and he's a really, really good athlete. The thing with McClain that I think you're going to see in this offense that Travis Trickett's going to run is they're going to want him to try and stand in the pocket more, step up and throw the football. Yeah. They're going to want him to read his progressions. And it felt like he plateaued towards the end of last season in terms of looking through his progressions and trying to find, an open receiver. And I think that was the biggest thing with him that kind of, leveled the playing field between him and Travis Marsh, was just that he hadn't been, it looked like he was, maybe looked at his first progression, maybe looked at his second progression, and then immediately wanted to take off and run. And I don't think that's going to work in Travis Trickett's offense at USF as he comes in. I think he's going to want him to deliver the football a little bit more instead of just wanting to take off immediately. Gerry Bohanon kind of fits that mold a little bit, right? Can escape. I've heard a lot of good things about his escapability. He ran for over 100 yards in the win over Oklahoma. I've heard a lot of good things about his ability to run the ball, but I've also heard really good things about him wanting to step up in the pocket and deliver a strong, accurate strike to be able to make plays in the passing game. And I think that could be a big aspect of how this competition is going to go, just kind of based on styles alone.
Yeah, and obviously you mentioned Travis Trickett. They also have a new defensive coordinator. So
Yes.
Jeff Scott changed out both coordinators here. Obviously, when you get Charlie Weiss getting an opportunity to go to the SEC, you can't blame him for taking that upgrade in terms of overall prestige and whatnot. Why the switch at defensive coordinator?
Well, in short, Glenn Spencer's defense wasn't getting it done. They gave up over 34 points a game last year. I think in the 2 years that Glenn Spencer was around USF and was the defensive coordinator, they had allowed, I think, 50 or more points at least 3 or 4 times. I think they had allowed 40 points in a game, 10 or 11 times in 2 seasons, mind you. And consider that 2020 season, they didn't play a full 12-game schedule because of the coronavirus pandemic. Now, there was a lot to be said about USF's ability to rush the quarterback. And that was kind of a big thing, was that USF, their defense was getting torn apart because quarterbacks had 5, 6, 7 seconds to sit in the pocket and be able to pick apart USF secondary, which, was depleted a lot of times throughout the year. Christian Williams, the Miami transfer, missed 6 weeks with a high ankle sprain. Kansas State transfer Will Jones missed the entire season with a torn ACL, suffered just 2 days before the season opener. Their secondary was depleted. They trotted out more than a few walk-ons during the year. And when, you're not getting pressure on the quarterback, and a quarterback could pick apart, a secondary, you've got to make sure that your secondary is fresh. But USF just didn't have that luxury last year. So that was a piece of it. But I think, ultimately just they weren't getting pressure on the quarterback, and that was just huge. I mean, USF was pretty low towards the bottom of the country, maybe even last in the FBS in terms of getting sacks and getting tackles for loss. If definitely not, definitely a bottom 5, a bottom 10 unit. Now, again, that could be said about defensive line play, about the personnel, just not having the depth in both rooms. But at the same time, you look at the game against Tulane, which was the penultimate week of the season. This was a game that USF was, they go out on the opening drive and they score easily, and they look like it's going to be, a pretty good day. There were, some tweets saying that Tulane players had gone out and partied the night before on Bourbon Street or something like that. So it seemed like USF, possibly had an easy win in the bag. But then Tulane goes out and scores like 30 points in the first half. and we're all kind of sitting in the press box looking at each other going, what the heck happened? And, and it was just a lot of, guys not being in the right places and not being able to get pressure on the quarterback. And I think that was the game. I mean, Glenn Spencer ended up getting fired the day after the game. That was the game where the wheels just kind of fell off, and it said, okay, it's time for change. And they made a good one. I think Bob Schupas could be really good. Completely different style of defense in terms of rushing the quarterback. He wants to be in your face, and I think that's going to be beneficial.
Well, and that's the thing I wanted to say. 9 sacks as a team for USF, if I'm looking at the stats correctly last year. And that it's pretty paltry. And BYU's had their own issues rushing the quarterback. So I think any BYU fan watching or listening to this would be like, okay, yeah, we get it too. We know about not getting after the quarterback and allowing those quarterbacks to feel like they're at home. All right. I want to get to a couple other questions here before we wrap up, Will, but I need to get another plug in here real quick for our friends at Bet Online. They're partners here with us on the Locked On Podcast Network. They continue to be the #1 source for all of your betting needs and sports information. Find all the latest odds, news, and sports developments for this year's basketball playoffs, Major League Baseball scores, the big fights around the country, and even next season's NFL futures. Bet Online remains your continued source for all of your sports wagering information, from live betting to playoffs, esports, and more. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends in action available to you now. It's all courtesy of your friends at Bet Online, where the game starts. All right, Will, before we wrap up here, I want to talk about the rush game for USF. And it seems like I'm looking at the statistics, and I remember last year, you mentioned Timmy McClain earlier on, his ability, I call him slippery. He was just impossible for BYU to corral defensively, and he kept USF, seemed like single-handedly in that game against BYU in Provo. But the rush attack, there are, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4 guys who had above 200 yards, one guy with 238, 324, 480, 671. So very balanced rush attack for the Bulls in 2021. Do you expect that to continue on into this season, or do you expect one of these backs to finally emerge and be the guy?
I think it'll be a pretty even workload. You mentioned the 397 that Kelly Joyner had. His stats are actually split up on the USF website. So he actually had over nearly 500 yards of rushing to his own credit. Now, Jaron Mangum came in from Michigan State last year, and was in his first season was nearing records. I mean, of rushing touchdowns in a season. He had 15 for the Bulls.
Yeah.
But if you look at those rushing touchdowns and where they came from, 90% of them came from inside the 10-yard line. He's a big back. USF hadn't had as big of a back as Mangum in quite a while. I mean, he's 6'2", all of 6'2". Well over 200 pounds. I mean, he's a big boy, and he was kind of the bruising style of running back that they wanted to bring in last offseason, and that's exactly what they did. And he was, and he was, a big piece of their success. You also look at, his game. Mangum only had three games rather of 85 yards or more because of that balanced attack. Now, Kelly Joyner Jr., on the other hand, kind of disappeared the first half of the season, then ripped off a couple 100-yard gains himself, and really, kind of became a spark plug in the midpoint of the season. Brian Batty, consensus All-American Brian Batty, was money in the kick return game, on the way to being named a consensus All-American, but also was really good in the running game. And he was one of USF's best backs that kind of dealt with a toe injury here and there, but it was one that we were kind of surprised just didn't get the playing time that we kind of thought that he would receive, especially in the second half of the season. Those three are going to be the guys. And they brought in Mikey Dukes, a transfer from Clemson. I've heard a lot of good things about his ability to catch passes out of the backfield. So that can be a nice little aspect that you haven't really seen much with the USF backs. Mangum should still be, a 15 to 20 carry guy every game. And then you can split kind of the rest of your carries between Kelly Joyner and Batty, Mikey Dukes. And then K'Wan Powell is a freshman that was, kind of in the hunt for playing time before tearing his ACL in fall camp. And, those five, USF, they've got some pretty desirable weapons across the offense, but I really like where that running back room stands heading into 22.
All right. So what we've been doing here, Will, just kind of pull back the curtain. We've been doing a countdown, getting us ready for the football season. We've been talking about the top 50 players of BYU history outside of the independent era and the top 50 players inside the independent era. And today we're talking about one of the guys in the independent era and a guy you're probably familiar with. Gunnar Romney is our honoree today. He actually was BYU's leading receiver in both of their previous matchups that he played in, both in the loss down there in 2019 in Tampa. He was the leading receiver last year, had a really nice game against USF in Provo. What do you remember about Gunnar, if anything, before I kind of give a little more on what I was going to talk about?
Yeah, well, I mean, he didn't he burn USF pretty early in that game. I'm going back looking at the box score. Yeah,
and it was
the third.
And it was his brother that threw him the touchdown pass.
Yeah, because last year was the game that the whole week we were trying to figure out if Jaron Hall was going to start or if Baylor Romney was going to start, and we were trying to figure it out, literally right up until kickoff. Yeah, no, what I remember about Gunnar Romney was just a solid receiver. He wasn't necessarily he didn't really have, terrific. He wasn't, gonna beat you on the outside with his speed, but he was just a really solid receiver that made catches and, burned USF for a 47-yarder that ultimately was the difference in the game, as USF tried to kind of get back, in that one. But yeah, I remember, with a last name like Romney, it's definitely easy to remember. But yeah, no, I just remember him being a really solid receiver that wasn't, like I said, going to beat you on the outside with his speed, but just a guy that made catches and was just a valuable part of the Cougar offense.
And see, the crazy thing about this is, and what we've been doing is we're talking about this, he's played 4 years at BYU, and seemingly every year he has had some sort of injury. Last year it was 2 MCL injuries. He got rolled up on twice during the season, came back relatively quickly from both of those to play, but he is finally trying to have a breakout season. He has had 162 yards, 377 yards. His big season was in 2020 with Zach Wilson throwing the ball all over the field, 767 yards. And then this past season, 594 yards. Obviously, he's had guys like Tyler Algier who have taken reps away from him. Dax Milne, who was with the Washington Commanders now. And the crazy thing about this is he will have his third crack at USF. And if history holds true, he might have a pretty nice game in Tampa once again. And hopefully I'm sure he wants the win more than anything else, because they lost the last time they played in Tampa. Yeah. But I was going to highlight that he's number 41 in our countdown here as we get closer and closer to the football season. So I figured I'd pull in a nice little tie with Gunner and the USF connection as we're talking with you, Will. All right. Final thing from me with you, Will, is I want to kind of get your sense for what an expectation is for USF this year. Is it to make a bowl game? Obviously, most teams that have been down like USF have, eventually they do want to make that bowl jump and then make jumps from there. But where is the expectation level this season for the Bulls?
Yeah, I think, if you would ask me that question last week, you'd probably get a different answer from where I'm at this week with it. Simply just because of the Gerry Bohanon transfer. I mean, sure. USF had no intention of bringing a quarterback in. I mean, they wanted to hit a couple scholarship spaces remaining, and they were adamant to use those on a couple offensive linemen, maybe another defensive lineman, maybe another defensive back. But I really had no intention of bringing in another quarterback because, like I said, you've already got your entrenched starter, and you've already got a guy right behind him that could, challenge for the starting spot. So bringing in a guy like Gerry Bohanon, I think, will make Vegas kind of up those win totals a little bit, because you're seeing that this staff has been, trying to change a culture. That's been, the words, that's been the phrase around campus over the last, 2 years that Jeff Scott's been the head coach. They wanted to change a culture. They wanted to improve the locker room. They wanted to make it more family oriented. They wanted to make it similar to Clemson. But now that they've done that, it's time to win games. And I think the Bohanon transfer, more than anything, indicates that USF wants to win games, and they want to win games in 2022. They don't want to wait till 23. I mentioned at the top, kind of their strength of schedule is pretty difficult. Just in general with what they've added over the non-conference slate. But the American isn't a cakewalk either by any means. Obviously, Cincinnati probably won't make another college football playoff like they did last season, but you still have to go to Nippert Stadium, and you still have to play that team up there. And that's a tough place to play. You got to go to Houston. USF hasn't beaten Houston since 2002. And Yep. It's one of the longest streaks. To be fair, they didn't play from 2002 to like 2013, but it's still a team that USF hasn't beaten in nearly 2 decades. But you got to go to TD-ECU Stadium and play Houston. You got to go to Philadelphia, and you got to play a Temple team. USF's never won in Philadelphia at Temple. Regardless of how good or bad Temple may be, you still haven't won there if you're USF. You got to go to Tulsa. You got to go to Louisville in non-conference play. You got to go to the Swamp. You got to play Florida. You got to, East Carolina's beat you 2 years in a row. SMU has beaten you the last 2-3 times they've played. UCF has beaten you 5 straight times, over the last 5 years. So, and then you've got BYU at the beginning of the season, which, is a tough opponent. So I think there was a path to 4 wins. I could see a path to 4 wins. Maybe you beat, you should theoretically beat Tulane. You should theoretically beat Temple. You lost to Tulsa by 1 point. Theoretically, you should beat Tulsa, even though you're on the road. And you should beat Howard, which is your FCS game of the year. So that's your 4, right? And I saw a path to 6 wins, right? But you got to pick off an East Carolina type. You got to pick off a Cincinnati type. You got to pick off a Houston, an SMU, a UCF, a BYU, a Louisville. One of those games that you're not supposed to that you're not favored to win. You got to pick off one of those teams in order to get the 6 wins. You got to pick off 2 of those teams in all reality. And another stat for USF is they're 0, they're 0 their last 10, I think, when it comes to games on the road. They were 0-6 last year in true road games. They were 0-5 in 2020. They've lost their last, dating back to 2019, they have lost their last 12 road games.
Wow. Okay.
Okay. They have not won a road game since October 26, 2019 at East Carolina, right? So if you want to win 6 games, you have to win on the road.
Mm-hmm.
You have to. I mean, it's no matter how difficult it is to pick off a road win in somebody else's stadium, you have to do it if you're USF. That's the biggest thing for them this year is they have to get a road win. Now, does that come in Philadelphia? Does that come at Tulsa? Does that come at Cincy, Florida, Louisville? We'll find out those answers. But in order to get to 6 wins, you have to be able to win one of those tough games, win 2 of those tough games. I think the path is there, and I think the Gerry Bohanon transfer helps with that. But I think 4 to 6 wins is an attainable slate. There's a lot of weapons on the offense. I think the offense is going to be fine. The question is the defense. And again, you brought in a defensive coordinator, you brought in a new offensive coordinator. You showed you replaced both your coordinators. You replaced them with guys that have won, guys that have been successful in their careers. And I think ultimately, that shows you want to win games. So they're showing a commitment to winning games, and now it's just time to go out on the field and execute and win those tough ball games.
Well, I, for one, am looking forward to it, getting down there to Tampa and watching this game, Will. Where can everybody find your work? Give them a plug real quick. Yeah,
so obviously my Twitter is right below my face. If you're watching the podcast at WTurner247, you can find my written work over at bulls247.com. Just dropped the podcast a few days ago about the Gerry Bohanon transfer, kind of talking it over with our Bears Illustrated contributor Garrett Ross, talking about kind of what it means from the Baylor perspective, and then kind of we'll obviously have some more content flavored towards BYU as we barrel towards that game in September. From what I hear, it could be a hot one. It could be a 12:00 game, and BYU doesn't travel very to Florida very well when it's hot. Did take care of UCF though a couple years ago, but I'm kind of hoping it's going to be that 100-degree type of game with about 85% relative humidity. And those Utah boys, they talk so much about the elevation, they don't talk as much about the humidity when they come to Tampa now.
Hey, BYU fans are well aware of their team wilting in that humidity, so that'll be something to monitor. There's no doubt about that. Will, we will have you on in the lead up to that game again for sure. Thank you so much for taking some time.
Of course. Thanks for having me, Jake.
All right, everybody. Just a reminder for you guys, follow the show Locked On Cougars on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter. Follow Will and all his great work as well. And also, thank you for making us your first listen of the day. Have a great rest of your day. Have a great weekend. We'll be back with you guys again on Monday. See ya.